December 1945, near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, a farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Samman was digging for fertilizer near a cliff face. His shovel struck something hard. He hesitated before breaking it open. Local legends spoke of genies trapped in jars, but curiosity and poverty won. Inside the sealed earthenware jar were 13 leather-bound books, papyrus codices, ancient, fragile, written in Coptic. He had no idea he'd just uncovered 52 texts that hadn't seen daylight in over 1,600 years. Among them was something the early church fathers had condemned, something they'd warned their congregations to avoid, something that described a version of Christianity so different from what became official doctrine that it had to be erased. Not just theologically different, structurally incompatible. These weren't random religious writings. They were texts that described wisdom returning to the world, not through hierarchies or priests, but through direct knowing, through individuals awakening to what they carry within, through women teaching and leading, through communities organizing without needing approval from above. The texts had names: Thunder, Perfect Mind, the Gospel of Mary, Pistis Sophia, the Gospel of Truth. And the historical record, the letters and council documents and banned book lists that survived the centuries, shows exactly how threatened the institutional church was by what these texts represented. Not because they were factually wrong, because they were structurally incompatible with centralized religious authority. What you're about to hear isn't speculation built on conspiracy theories or internet rumors. The texts I'm going to discuss exist in university libraries. You can read them yourself. Translations are available for free online through academic institutions. The pattern of institutional suppression I'm going to trace is documented in surviving letters from bishops, in the records of church councils, in banned book lists that were enforced for over a millennium. What makes this the Vatican's darkest secret isn't that they hid a single document in some underground vault. It's that the entire institutional structure of Christianity as we know it was built, deliberately and strategically, on preventing what these texts describe from ever happening. And here's what makes this truly unsettling. It's happening anyway, right now, all around you. The pattern these ancient texts describe, the prophecy they encode, is unfolding in measurable ways across communities worldwide, not as some supernatural intervention, as a structural dynamic, a pattern of how decentralized wisdom movements rise, get suppressed, survive underground, and re-emerge when conditions allow. The text understood this pattern 1,700 years ago. The institutional church understood it too. That's why they fought so hard to erase it, and that's why we need to understand it now. Before we go deeper into what these texts actually say, and how the suppression unfolded, if you want to understand how ancient spiritual movements connect to the power structures you're living under today, subscribe to this channel. This is where we trace the pattern. This is where we read the sources directly instead of accepting the official version. Let me give you context for why the Nag Hammadi discovery mattered so much. Before 1945, scholars knew that early Christianity had been more diverse than the official story suggested. We had references in the writings of church fathers, people like Irenaeus and Tertullian, who wrote long treatises condemning what they called heresies. They mentioned texts we didn't have. They quoted fragments. They described communities that believed very different things than what would become Orthodox Christianity. But we didn't have the actual texts. We only had the orthodox responses, the condemnations, the refutations. It's like trying to understand a trial when you only have the prosecutor's closing argument and none of the defendant's testimony. Then Nag Hammadi changed everything. Suddenly we had the texts themselves, not filtered through hostile summaries, not paraphrased by people trying to make them sound ridiculous. The actual words that actual communities read and valued enough to copy carefully onto expensive papyrus, to bind into leather covers, to hide in sealed jars when persecution came. And what scholars found when they started translating these texts was both surprising and completely predictable. Surprising because the theological variety was wider than anyone expected. Predictable because the texts that got suppressed most thoroughly were exactly the ones that threatened institutional power most directly. Let's start with one of the most striking texts in the collection, Thunder Perfect Mind. The title itself is provocative. This is a revelation text, a first-person speech by a divine figure. But the figure speaking isn't the God of Orthodox Christianity. It's a feminine divine presence who speaks in paradoxes and refuses every attempt to categorize her. The text begins with a sending formula, I was sent forth from the power, which establishes divine authority. But then it immediately subverts every conventional religious category. Listen to what this voice says. I am the first and the last. I am the honored one and the scorned one. I am the whore and the holy one. I am the wife and the virgin. I am the mother and the daughter. I am the members of my mother. I am the barren one, and many are her sons. The text goes on like this for pages. Each line collapses a binary opposition. Each paradox refuses the either-or, thinking that institutional religion depends on to maintain categories of pure and impure, acceptable and forbidden, insider and outsider. Why does this matter? Because religious institutions maintain control partly through classification. They tell you what's holy and what's profane. They tell you who can approach the sacred and who must be kept separate. They tell you which roles are for men and which are forbidden to women. Thunder Perfect Mind systematically demolishes those classifications. The voice speaking doesn't ask for permission to be both virgin and whore, both first and last, both silence and sound. She simply is. And the text invites you to hear her, to recognize her, to stop waiting for someone else to tell you what's sacred and what's not. Church fathers writing in the 3rd and 4th centuries condemned texts like this. They called them blasphemous, confusing, dangerous. Why dangerous? Not because the theology was intellectually incoherent, because it was institutionally uncontrollable. If the divine speaks directly to individuals in paradoxes that refuse simple categorization, then you don't need priests to interpret. You don't need bishops to tell you what's acceptable. You don't need councils to define orthodoxy. You just need to listen. That's the threat. Direct access makes mediators obsolete. Now let's look at the Gospel of Mary. This text survives in fragments. We're missing pages, but what remains is extraordinary. The scene is set after the resurrection. The risen Christ has appeared to the disciples and departed. They're grieving and confused. Mary Magdalene steps forward and tells them not to be distressed. She says the teacher prepared them for this. Then Peter asks her to share any teaching that the risen Christ gave to her privately, teaching the male disciples weren't present for. And Mary begins to describe a vision. She recounts an interior journey of the soul ascending through cosmic powers. It's mystical, symbolic, complex. And when she finishes, Andrew responds with skepticism. He says he doesn't believe the teacher would have given her these strange teachings. Peter goes further. He asks, did he really speak with a woman in private without our knowledge? Are we supposed to turn around and all listen to her? He's not just questioning the content. He's questioning whether a woman has the authority to teach at all, whether the male disciples should be expected to receive instruction from her. Another disciple, Levi, defends Mary. He tells Peter that if the teacher made her worthy, who is he to reject her? The teacher knew her completely and loved her devotedly. The text doesn't resolve this conflict with a clear verdict. It just presents it. But the very existence of this text tells us something crucial. There were early Christian communities where this scene made sense, communities where it was plausible, even expected, that Mary Magdalene would be a primary teacher, that she would receive direct revelations, that she would instruct the male disciples, and that any resistance to her teaching was a problem with the men's understanding, not with her authority. Compare that to the Christianity that became dominant. By the 4th and 5th centuries, women were increasingly excluded from teaching roles. The logic was that women were naturally more susceptible to deception, going back to Eve in the garden. Women could be virtuous supporters of the church, could be saints even, but they couldn't be priests. They couldn't teach men. They couldn't interpret scripture with authority. The Gospel of Mary preserves a completely different model, and the institutional church made very sure that model didn't spread. Then there's Pistis Sophia. This is a longer, more complex text. It's not one you can summarize in a few sentences. The narrative is mythological, cosmic in scale. Sophia, which means wisdom in Greek, is a divine feminine figure. An aeon, an emanation from the highest divine source. In the story, Sophia looks downward from the realm of light into the darkness of matter and chaos below. She desires to bring light into that darkness, but in her descent, she becomes trapped. The powers that rule the material world, called archons in the text, see her as an intruder. They don't want light and wisdom in their domain. They want to keep her trapped, to drain her power, to prevent her return. The bulk of the text is Sophia's lamentations and petitions. She cries out to the highest divine realm for rescue. She confesses that her desire to bring light below was perhaps naive, that she underestimated the powers of darkness. She repents, not in the sense of moral wrongdoing, but in the sense of recognizing she needs help to return. And gradually, through a series of divine interventions, she's restored, brought back to her proper place. The light she tried to bring into darkness is rescued from being extinguished. Wisdom returns to where it belongs. Now, on one level, this is mythological cosmology. It's a story about divine beings and cosmic regions. But everyone who studied these texts in antiquity, and everyone who studies them now, recognizes that the cosmology is also psychology. Sophia's fall is about what happens when wisdom, when direct knowing, gets trapped in systems that don't want it, systems that prefer control over understanding. Her lamentations are about the suffering of anyone who tries to bring light into institutional darkness and gets crushed for it. Her restoration is about recovery, about remembering, about wisdom returning to itself. And here's the key move that makes this text so threatening. In Pistis Sophia, the one who rescues her isn't a priest or a bishop or a council. It's an interior recognition. It's her remembering who she is and calling out from that knowledge. And the text says explicitly that this same pattern can happen in you. You too can remember. You too can call out. You too can be restored. You don't need an intermediary. You need recognition. That's the prophecy embedded in the story. Wisdom will be scattered, will seem lost, will cry out in the darkness, and then it will remember itself, it will return, and the structures built on keeping it trapped will crack. If you're starting to see how these texts function, how they're not just ancient theological curiosities, but actually maps of how power operates and how it can be challenged, let me know by liking this video. It tells me you're ready to trace this pattern through history. Let me make the prophetic structure explicit. These texts describe a three-phase pattern. You could call it a cycle or a process. First phase, the fall. Wisdom, direct knowing, spiritual authority, all of that starts out distributed. It's everywhere. It's in you, it's in your neighbor, it's in women and men, in the educated and the unlearned. But then something happens. It gets captured, institutionalized. Experts emerge who claim they're the only ones qualified to interpret. Priests claim they're the only ones who can mediate between you and the divine. Hierarchies form. And most people forget they ever had direct access. They externalize their knowing. They become dependent. Second phase, the exile and preservation. The direct knowing doesn't disappear. It can't. It's too fundamental to human experience, but it goes underground. It survives in the margins. In mystics who have visions the church can't quite suppress because they're too holy or too well connected. In folk practices that continue even when officially discouraged. In grandmothers who know how to heal with herbs. In poetry and songs that carry the memory in coded form. In secret manuscripts that get copied and hidden. The knowing is exiled, but not erased, it waits. Third phase, the return and restoration. This is the prophetic moment. The texts say there will come a time when the conditions are right and the scattered wisdom starts to remember itself. Not all at once, not through a single dramatic event, through small awakenings multiplied across many people, through individuals who stop asking permission to know what they know, through communities that organize outside official structures, through women who reclaim teaching authority, through practices that rebuild what was shattered. And the texts say this return will be unstoppable, not because it's supernaturally guaranteed, because it's structurally inevitable. Once enough people remember, the systems built on their forgetting can't be sustained. Now let's trace how the institutional church responded to these texts and the communities that valued them. We have specific documentation. In the year 367 CE, Athanasius, the Bishop of Alexandria, wrote what's called his 39th festal letter. Every year, bishops would write letters to their congregations around Easter, giving instructions and offering theological guidance. This particular letter is famous because it contains the earliest complete list of the 27 books that would become the New Testament canon. Athanasius lists which books are scripture and which aren't. But he doesn't stop there. He goes further. He specifically warns against what he calls apocryphal books. He lists some by name, and then he gives a theological reason for rejecting them. He says these books lead simple believers astray by suggesting they can access divine truth apart from the teaching authority of the church. Now, Athanasius doesn't use those exact words. I'm paraphrasing, but the concern is clear when you read the letter. He's not primarily worried about factual errors or bad history. He's worried about the wrong people claiming spiritual authority. He's worried about texts that encourage individual interpretation instead of deference to bishops. And here's the crucial instruction at the end of the letter. He tells his congregations that these apocryphal books should not be read. Period. No exceptions, no private study, no curiosity. If you encounter them, you're supposed to reject them immediately and report to your bishop if you see anyone circulating them. This isn't theological debate. This is information control. And it worked. Within a few generations, most of these texts had disappeared from circulation in the Christian communities that followed Athanasius's guidance. The ones that survived did so because communities who didn't accept his authority kept copying them, or because someone, somewhere, had the foresight to bury them in a jar before they could be destroyed. The Council of Rome in 382 CE took the canonization process further. Pope Damasus convened this council partly to address questions about which texts were authoritative scripture and which weren't. The list they produced became the foundation for what we now call the biblical canon in Catholic and later Protestant Christianity. But just as important as what they included was what they excluded. And if you look at the categories of exclusion, a pattern emerges. Texts that center feminine imagery for the divine, excluded. Texts where women teach authoritatively, excluded. Texts that describe salvation as awakening to knowledge rather than submitting to church authority, excluded. Now the official theological language used to justify these exclusions was about heresy and doctrinal error. The Church Fathers argued these texts taught false cosmologies, misunderstood the nature of Christ, promoted moral laxity, and in some cases those concerns were genuine, But when you look at which texts got the harshest condemnation and the most thorough suppression, it's not the ones with the worst theology by orthodox standards, it's the ones that most directly threaten institutional control. Think about it structurally. If you're building an institution, you need mechanisms of control. You need to be able to say who's in and who's out, who's authorized to teach and who isn't, what counts as legitimate spiritual experience and what's delusion or demonic deception. You need hierarchies, rules, procedures. Now imagine a text circulating in your communities that says any woman can receive direct revelation, that says you don't need priests to access the divine, that says the whole cosmos is trying to wake up and remember its divine nature. How do you maintain institutional coherence when texts like that are available? You can't, so you suppress them, not out of malice necessarily, out of institutional survival instinct. Let's jump forward to the 13th century, because the pattern doesn't stop in the ancient world. The Cathars were a Christian movement in southern France, in a region called Occitania. Their theology was dualistic. They believed the material world was created by an evil or inferior deity and that the true God was purely spiritual. They rejected the Catholic sacraments, didn't believe in hell, thought the institutional church was corrupt. And crucially, they honored women as spiritual teachers and leaders. Women could become parfaits, the Cathar equivalent of priests. Women taught, women led rituals, women interpreted scripture. The Cathars weren't reading the Nag Hammadi texts. Those were buried and lost. But they developed a form of Christianity that resonated with similar themes. Direct spiritual experience over institutional mediation, suspicion of material wealth and hierarchy, gender equality in spiritual authority, and they were successful. By the early 1200s, Catharism was the dominant religion in parts of southern France. Entire noble families had converted. Towns built Cathar meeting houses. The Catholic Church was losing territory, influence, money. Pope Innocent III tried persuasion first. He sent preachers, including St. Dominic, to debate the Cathars and win them back through argument. It didn't work. The Cathars had charismatic teachers of their own, and a population that was deeply dissatisfied with Catholic corruption. So in 1209, the Pope called for a crusade, not against Muslims in the Holy Land, against Christians in France, the Albigensian Crusade. And it was brutal. The Crusaders were offered the same spiritual rewards, the same indulgences, as if they were fighting in Jerusalem. Towns were besieged and burned. When the Crusaders took the town of Béziers, they reportedly killed everyone, Catholics and Cathars alike, thousands of people. The quote attributed to the papal legate was, "Kill them all, God will know his own." Over 20 years, the crusade systematically destroyed Cathar communities. Massacres, executions, forced conversions. By the mid-1200s, organized Catharism was effectively extinct. And here's what we need to understand. This wasn't primarily about theology. The theological differences could have been debated endlessly without violence. This was about power, about territory, about who gets to define Christianity, and about the structural threat of a functioning alternative. The Cathars proved you could organize Christian communities without bishops, without the sacraments, without male-only priesthood. That proof had to be eliminated. Not argued against. Eliminated. If something in you is recognizing this pattern, if you've felt that friction between what institutions tell you and what you sense directly, I left something in the first pinned comment. It's not for everyone. It's for people who are done waiting for permission to trust their own knowing. Now let's talk about how this pattern of suppression continued right up into the modern era. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books, was the Catholic Church's official list of publications that Catholics were forbidden to read. It was first issued in 1559 and was continuously updated until it was finally abolished in 1966. Think about that timeline. 1966. That's after the moon landing was already being planned, after the Civil Rights Act, after Vatican II started modernizing Catholic practice. And even in 1966, there were still books on that list related to Gnostic Christianity, to alternative interpretations of early church history, to texts about Sophia and feminine divine imagery. Why keep those restrictions in place for so long? The official explanation was pastoral care, protecting simple believers from confusion and error. But consider what it means functionally. For 400 years, from the Reformation until the 1960s, if you were a Catholic and you wanted to read scholarly work on early Christian diversity, you needed special permission. You had to apply to your bishop. You had to have an approved reason. Ordinary curiosity wasn't enough. And if you read the forbidden material without permission, you were subject to excommunication. That's not protecting people from error. That's controlling information. That's making sure the official narrative is the only narrative most people ever encounter. And even after the index was abolished, the pattern continues in subtler forms. It's not formal censorship anymore. It's about what gets funded, what gets published by major academic presses, who gets invited to conferences, whose work gets reviewed in mainstream outlets. Scholars who work on early Christian diversity, on the role of women in the early church, on Gnostic texts, they consistently report experiencing institutional resistance. Not always, not from everyone, but often enough to notice. Funding gets questioned, tenure cases get complicated, speaking invitations to Catholic institutions get withdrawn. It's not conspiracy, it's institutional inertia protecting itself. So when those texts were discovered in 1945, when Muhammad Ali al-Samman cracked open that jar and started pulling out codices, it wasn't just an archaeological find. It was the reopening of a case the Church thought it had permanently closed. For 16 centuries, the institutional Church had successfully controlled the narrative about early Christianity. Yes, there were heretics. Yes, there were deviations. But they were small, marginal, confused. Nothing serious. Nothing that represented a real alternative to orthodox belief. And then Nag Hammadi said, wait, look at this. Entire communities preserving texts about divine wisdom as feminine, about Mary Magdalene as a primary teacher, about salvation as awakening rather than submission. The scholarly response had to be careful. This was the 1940s and 50s. Academic biblical studies was still dominated by confessional scholars, people who were also ordained ministers or priests. They couldn't just dismiss the texts. The manuscripts were real and academically fascinating, but they also couldn't embrace them too enthusiastically without threatening their own institutional positions. So the framing that emerged was measured. These texts show early Christian diversity. They complicate our understanding of orthodoxy. They're valuable for historical study, but they're not viable spiritual alternatives. They're curiosities, windows into a lost world, not maps for the present. And that framing held for decades. The Nag Hammadi library was published, translated, studied in universities, but it was treated as ancient history. Interesting for specialists, not relevant for people's actual spiritual lives. Then something shifted. Starting in the 1970s and accelerating through the 80s and 90s, feminist scholars started asking different questions. Why were these texts suppressed? What would Christianity look like if the Gospel of Mary had been in the canon? What changed when women's voices were erased from authoritative teaching? And suddenly, the Nag Hammadi texts weren't just historical curiosities anymore. They were evidence of paths not taken, evidence of what was lost, evidence of what could be recovered. Now let me show you how the pattern these texts describe is actually unfolding in the world today. Start with restorative justice. Traditional criminal justice systems operate on a hierarchical model. A crime is committed. Police investigate. Prosecutors charge. Judges sentence. The defendant is essentially passive, receiving judgment from above. The victim often feels excluded, like they're just evidence in someone else's case. And the outcome is punishment. The goal is retribution and deterrence, not healing or repair. Restorative justice completely inverts that structure. When harm occurs, instead of immediately going to court, a trained facilitator brings together everyone affected. The person who caused harm, the person harmed, family members, community representatives. They sit in a circle. Everyone speaks. The person who caused harm has to actually face the people they hurt, has to listen to the impact, has to take real responsibility, not in a legal sense of pleading guilty, in a human sense of acknowledging what they did and why it matters. Then the circle works together to figure out what repair looks like. Sometimes that includes accountability measures, things the person who caused harm needs to do. Sometimes it includes support, because often people cause harm because they're drowning in their own unaddressed trauma. The goal isn't punishment. The goal is to make things as right as possible and prevent future harm. And study after study shows this approach works better than traditional prosecution for many types of crime. Lower reoffending rates, higher victim satisfaction, stronger community connections. The data is there. Now here's why this matters for our story. Restorative justice circles don't have judges. They don't have lawyers arguing from opposing sides. They don't have a hierarchy where someone above imposes a solution on those below. It's horizontal. It's collaborative. Everyone's voice matters. Authority comes from the process, from the shared commitment to repair, not from an office or credential. That's the exact structure the Sophia texts describe. Wisdom operating through mutual recognition rather than top-down control. It's the prophecy manifesting in criminal justice reform. Look at worker cooperatives. Traditional businesses have a clear hierarchy. Owners at the top, shareholders if it's public. Management in the middle, workers at the bottom. Decisions flow downward, profits flow upward. You work for someone. You take orders. You might have input, but you don't have power. Worker cooperatives structure things completely differently. The people who work in the business own it collectively. Major decisions are made democratically. One worker, one vote. Profits are shared. If the business does well, everyone benefits. If it struggles, everyone works together on solutions. The Mondragon Corporation in Spain is the famous example. It's not a small hippie commune. It's a federation of cooperatives employing over 80,000 people, operating in manufacturing, finance, education, retail. It's one of Spain's largest corporations, and it functions as a cooperative. Workers elect management. Major strategic decisions require democratic approval. Wages are capped, so the highest paid person can't earn more than a certain multiple of the lowest paid person. It's been operating since 1956. It survived the 2008 financial crisis better than most traditionally structured businesses. It works, and cooperatives are spreading. There are worker co-ops in every industry you can think of. Tech co-ops in San Francisco, cleaning co-ops in New York, manufacturing co-ops in Ohio, agricultural co-ops worldwide. None of them are doing this because they read Gnostic texts and decided to implement Sophia's prophecy. They're doing it because they got tired of working for bosses who extracted their labor and gave them scraps. They organized. They created alternatives. But the structure they created aligns perfectly with what those ancient texts describe. Authority that's distributed. Wisdom that operates through collaboration. Economic life organized around mutual care rather than domination. That's the pattern reactivating. Look at what's happening with women's ordination. For most of Christian history, the position was clear. Women couldn't be priests. They couldn't preach. They couldn't administer sacraments. They could be nuns. They could teach children. They could do charity work. But they couldn't stand at the altar. Why? The official theological reasons varied. Women were too associated with the body, with matter, with sin. Women weren't made in God's image in the same way men were. Women's natural role was submission. Jesus chose male apostles, so only men can carry apostolic authority. Different churches gave different justifications, but the result was the same: no women priests. That started changing in the 20th century. Some Protestant denominations began ordaining women in the 1950s and 60s: Episcopalians, Lutherans, Methodists. It was controversial, lots of resistance, but it happened. The Catholic Church held firm. In 1976, the Vatican issued a declaration saying women's ordination was not possible. It was against divine law. The matter was settled. The Anglican Communion went back and forth, some provinces allowing it, others refusing. Orthodox Christianity hasn't budged. But here's what's happening anyway. Women are being ordained in denominations that officially allow it, thousands of them. They're leading churches, teaching theology, interpreting scripture with full institutional authority. And in places where women's ordination is forbidden, women are doing it anyway. There's a movement of women being ordained as Catholic priests through alternative lineages, bishops who broke with Rome to perform ordinations. Are those ordinations valid by Catholic canon law? No. Do these women care? Also no. They're celebrating Mass, hearing confessions, anointing the sick. They're being priests, without permission, without waiting for the institution to approve. And feminist theological movements have gone further. They're not just arguing women should be allowed into the existing structure. They're questioning whether the existing structure is worth preserving at all. Why do we need priests as mediators? Why do we need hierarchical authority? Why can't spiritual wisdom be recognized wherever it arises, regardless of gender or credential? These aren't abstract theological questions. They're leading to practical experiments. Women-led house churches, feminist liturgies, goddess spirituality integrated with Christian practice. Some of these experiments stay within institutional Christianity. Some move beyond it. But all of them are recovering something that was lost: the memory that women can teach, can lead, can embody spiritual authority. The memory these ancient texts preserved. So why is all this terrifying to institutions built on centralized authority? Let me be very precise about the structural logic. Institutions derive their legitimacy from being necessary. A church is legitimate because you need it to access the sacraments, to receive valid teaching, to be part of the community of salvation. A government is legitimate because you need it to maintain order and provide services you can't provide yourself. An expert class is legitimate because you need specialized knowledge you don't have. As long as people believe they need the institution has power. Now imagine texts circulating that say, you don't need the institution, you can access divine wisdom directly. You can organize your community without hierarchical authority. You can resolve conflicts through horizontal processes. You can create economic structures based on mutual ownership. And imagine these aren't just theoretical claims, they're backed up by actual practices. Restorative justice circles that work, worker cooperatives that thrive, women-led spiritual communities that provide everything the official church provides without requiring submission to bishops. What happens to institutional legitimacy when functional alternatives exist? The institution has three options. 1. Adapt. Incorporate the challenge. Allow women's ordination. Embrace more democratic governance. Acknowledge that some wisdom operates outside official channels. Some institutions do this. They survive by becoming less authoritarian, more collaborative. 2. Resist and maintain boundaries. Dig in. Reassert traditional authority. Punish dissenters. Hope the challenge passes. Some institutions do this too. Sometimes it works for a while. 3. Collapse. Lose relevance. Watch as people simply stop caring what the institution approves or forbids and organize alternatives that meet their needs better. We're seeing all three responses play out simultaneously in different parts of global Christianity today. Let me give you a concrete example of how the institutional response continues in subtle ways. When portions of the Vatican archives were opened to researchers in recent decades, there was tremendous excitement in the scholarly community. Documents that had been completely inaccessible might finally be available. Historians immediately requested access to files related to the Church's interactions with early Christian diversity scholarship. Documents about how the Vatican responded to the Nag Hammadi discovery, correspondence with scholars working on Gnostic texts, and what happened. Some material was made available, some wasn't. The official explanations were always procedural. This section hasn't been catalogued yet. That material is too fragile and needs conservation first. These documents are still classified under policies dating back to when they were created. All technically true. But when you look at the pattern of what remains restricted, it correlates suspiciously well with material that might be historically embarrassing, or that might reveal institutional anxiety about theological challenges. I'm not claiming there's a smoking gun memo where a pope says hide this, so no one knows we were afraid of Gnostic texts. That's not how institutions work. The suppression is structural, procedural, bureaucratic. It happens through slow cataloging timelines and conservative classification policies and funding decisions about which archives to digitize first. It's not conspiracy. It's institutional inertia protecting itself through 1,000 small gatekeeping decisions that add up to controlled narratives and limited access. So let me return to the central question. Is this actually prophecy? And the answer depends on how you understand that word. If you mean supernatural prediction, someone in the ancient world accessing information about the future through mystical means, then no. These texts aren't fortune-telling. They're not giving you next week's lottery numbers or the date when institutions will collapse. But if you mean structural insight, understanding how patterns unfold across time, how power operates, how suppressed alternatives survive and re-emerge, then yes, these are profoundly prophetic texts. They understood that wisdom, direct knowing, communal authority, all of that is too fundamental to human experience to be permanently suppressed. You can drive it underground. You can make it dangerous to practice openly. You can destroy the texts that describe it, but you can't erase it. Because it's not just an idea, it's a capacity. It's part of how humans are built. We recognize wisdom when we encounter it. We know when we're being manipulated by people claiming authority they haven't earned. We can tell the difference between rules that serve life and rules that serve power. That knowing might get buried under layers of conditioning and institutional messaging, but it doesn't die, it waits. And when conditions shift, when the institutional control weakens or people get desperate enough or alternatives become visible, the knowing reactivates. The texts describe that process as Sophia's return, wisdom remembering herself, rising from exile, reclaiming her place. For ancient communities reading these texts mythologically, that was a cosmic drama involving divine beings and spiritual realms. For us, reading them now, it's social psychology and political structure, but it's the same pattern. The prophecy isn't that a goddess will descend from the sky. The prophecy is that the pattern of decentralized wisdom reactivating is unstoppable once enough people remember. And we're watching it happen. In restorative justice, in cooperative economics, in women reclaiming spiritual authority, in people trusting their direct knowing over institutional pronouncements. The prophecy is unfolding, not supernaturally, structurally. So what do you actually do with this understanding? I'm going to give you 3 practices, but I want to be clear about what these are. They're not spiritual exercises designed to make you feel good or give you mystical experiences. They're recognition training. They're designed to help you notice when the pattern is operating so you can participate consciously instead of getting swept along unconsciously. First practice, receptive awareness. Set aside 15 minutes a day. Sit somewhere quiet. Close your eyes. Don't meditate in the sense of trying to achieve some special state. Just listen to what arises internally when you're not filling the space with distraction or planning or rehearsing conversations. Thoughts will come. Notice them. Label them if you want. Planning, worrying, remembering, then let them pass and return to listening. What you're training is the capacity to distinguish between noise and signal, between the conditioning you've absorbed from institutions and the direct knowing that operates underneath. You won't get this distinction right immediately. It takes time. But over weeks and months of practice, you start to recognize a quality of knowing that's different from belief or opinion or fear. It's quieter, more certain, less defensive. That's what the texts call Sophia, not a being, a quality of awareness. You're training yourself to notice when it's present. Second practice, horizontal conflict resolution. Next time you're in a conflict with someone, whether it's personal or professional, try this instead of arguing or appealing to authority. Propose that you both sit down with a timer. You each get 10 minutes to speak while the other listens without interrupting. No rebuttals, no corrections, just listening. Then, after both of you have spoken, sit in silence for 2 minutes. Don't rush to solutions or compromises. Just let what you've heard settle. Then if you want to continue, do another round. What you're doing is practicing authority that comes from mutual recognition instead of power. You're experiencing what it feels like when wisdom operates horizontally instead of through dominance. Third practice, unauthorized action. This is the most challenging one. Identify one area of your life where you're waiting for permission to do something you know needs doing. Maybe it's a creative project you're not attempting because you don't have the credentials. Maybe it's speaking up about something wrong at work because you're not senior enough. Maybe it's teaching something you know even though you're not officially certified. Ask yourself honestly, am I waiting because I actually don't know enough? Or am I waiting because I've internalized the message that my knowing doesn't count unless institutions validate it? If it's the second one, stop waiting. Do the thing. Create the project. Speak up. Teach. Not recklessly. Not without preparation, but without waiting for permission from people who have no more access to truth than you do. That's the prophecy in action. Wisdom rising without asking approval. Let me bring this full circle to what the Vatican's darkest secret actually is. It's not a document. It's not a conspiracy. It's not a single suppressed truth hidden in a vault. The secret is this. The institutional church, and really any institution built on centralized control of knowledge and authority, has always known that their power depends on a forgetting. They need you to forget that you can access wisdom directly. They need you to forget that women can teach and lead. They need you to forget that communities can organize without hierarchies. They need you to forget that spiritual authority comes from recognition, not from office. The Nag Hammadi texts are terrifying to that kind of institution because they're documentary proof that the forgetting wasn't natural or inevitable. It was engineered. There were Christian communities in the 1st and 2nd centuries who remembered, who practiced direct knowing, who honored women as teachers, who organized horizontally. Those communities existed, they thrived, they produced texts preserving their practices, and then they were systematically suppressed. Their texts were banned. Their practices were criminalized. Their members were sometimes killed, not because they were crazy or wicked, because they were incompatible with what institutional Christianity was becoming. And the really terrifying part, from an institutional perspective, is that the suppression didn't work permanently. The texts survived, buried in jars. The practices survived, in mystics and folk traditions and grandmothers passing down knowledge. The memory survived, even when people didn't know they were carrying it. And now it's reactivating. Not because someone found a secret text and decided to implement it, because the pattern is structural. When institutions fail to meet people's needs, when hierarchies become obviously self-serving, when official answers stop making sense, people start looking for alternatives, and they discover over and over the same basic insights. You can know things directly. You can trust your inner sense. You can organize collaboratively. You can resolve harm without domination. That's Sophia returning, not as a goddess, as a pattern of human possibility that institutions can suppress for a while, but never permanently eliminate. Muhammad Ali al-Samman died in 1978. He never knew the full significance of what he'd found. He sold most of the codices for almost nothing. One ended up in Cairo at the Coptic Museum, others scattered. Some pages were used as kindling before scholars realized what they were. It took decades to gather all the manuscripts, translate them, publish them. But that process, clumsy and incomplete as it was, reopened something the institutional church thought it had sealed shut 1600 years ago. A window into what Christianity was before the councils and the creeds and the hierarchies solidified. A window into what it could be again if people chose differently. The texts Muhammad Ali found described a pattern. Wisdom falls, gets trapped, cries out and returns, not through institutional permission, through recognition, through remembering, through people awakening to what they carry within and organizing accordingly. And every mechanism the church deployed to prevent that return, from banned book lists to crusades to strategic framing of scholarship, all of it confirms the same thing. They knew. They've always known. They knew these texts represented a viable alternative. They knew the alternative was structurally incompatible with centralized religious authority. They knew that if enough people encountered these ideas, the whole edifice might crack. So they fought to suppress them. For 17 centuries they fought, and they failed. The texts came back, the pattern came back. Sophia came back, not as intervention, as recognition. People remembering what was always there. If you stayed until the end of this, I want you to understand what that means. You've just spent significant time engaging with ideas that were suppressed for 1700 years, ideas people were killed for preserving, ideas institutions worked tirelessly to erase, and you encountered them anyway. That's not supernatural. That's structural inevitability, wisdom, finding its way back. If you recognize something true in this, if something in you was already awake, and this just gave it language, let me know by writing in the comments. I choose direct knowing. It's not a magical incantation. It's a public statement. It tells the algorithm to show this to other people who are ready. It tells me where the recognition is active. And it tells you by writing it that you're participating consciously in the pattern instead of being passively carried by it. I've placed another video on your screen right now that goes deeper into specific mechanisms of institutional control and how they're dissolving. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you in the next one.